Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of cryptid stories for you to enjoy. So buckle up, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My dad never believed in the paranormal. No ghosts, no aliens, no Bigfoot, none of it. He was a practical man, raised in the woods of Missouri, and he lived his life rooted in what he could see, hear, and touch. That's why I never forgot the look on his face when he finally told me this story. He didn't speak of it until I was grown, and even then, his hands trembled just recalling it. I'd never seen my dad scared before, not like that. This happened back in 1960, during one of his many late-night coon hunts. He and a close buddy of his, another seasoned woodsman, had taken their dogs out to a small conservation area about 5 miles from the house. It's a peaceful stretch of land, mostly untouched, with a cold spring that runs through it, primitive campsites and some old picnic tables scattered here and there. In the daytime, it's the kind of place you take your family for a picnic. But at night, it becomes something else entirely. They arrived sometime after dark. The air was warm and still, typical Missouri summer night. My dad said they let the dogs loose and sat on the tailgate of the truck, listening to them work the woods. These were well-trained hounds, loyal, disciplined animals that knew the job. Eventually, the dogs treed a coon, and the men followed their barks through the undergrowth. The tree wasn't far, maybe 10 to 15 minutes from the truck. They leashed the dogs and gave them some praise, and were just turning to head back when something changed. The dogs, who had been calm and focused moments before, suddenly dropped their tails and began to whimper. My dad's biggest male hound, a dog that had been through dozens of hunts and was afraid of nothing, started shaking. Then he yanked hard, broke free of my dad's grip, and took off into the woods whining like a pup. Then they heard it. A low, guttural sound like a growl, but not like any animal they'd encountered before. It wasn't a bobcat, it wasn't a bear, and it definitely wasn't human. My dad said it was a deep, bone-vibrating growl that didn't seem to come from one place but all around them. Then came heavy, deliberate footsteps circling them. Now these were two men who knew the forest better than most people know their own homes. They were armed, experienced, and did not scare easy. But whatever this was, it stayed just outside the beam of their headlamps. Every time they turned, they caught nothing, just shadows and a crackle of brush. Then came the chattering. He described it as a kind of whispered mutter, fast and erratic, like someone talking to themselves in a language that wasn't meant to be heard. It circled with footsteps, stalking them, intelligent and watching. That was when my dad drew his gun and fired 2 shots into the air. The sound exploded through the trees and then everything went dead silent. No wind, no insects, just movement. Just this eerie, unnatural stillness pressing in on them. They didn't wait. Which few hadn't bolted and made a straight line for the truck. When they got there, my dad's big male hound, the one who ran, was already waiting for them. He was curled under the tailgate, trembling like a leaf. My dad said the other dogs were cowering, tails tucked, some even trying to climb into their laps. That alone was chilling. These were hunting dogs, born and bred for rough conditions, but they looked absolutely broken. Then they checked the time. What should have been 30 to 40 minutes at most had somehow taken over 2 hours. Neither man could account for it. They hadn't wandered, hadn't gotten turned around. The trees had been close. There was no way they were out there for that long. But the clock didn't lie. He said they never told anyone, not a soul, only each other. My dad didn't even tell my mum the whole story until later that night. She told me, after he passed, that he came home pale as a sheet. A man who had faced down wild animals, storms, even armed strangers in the woods. And that was the only time she'd ever seen him truly shaken. He told me once before he died, "I don't know what was out there, I just know it wasn't supposed to be. Whatever stalked them in those woods that night, it wasn't animal. It wasn't human. And it sure as hell wasn't afraid of two men with guns and a pack of dogs. My family is Russian. Both my parents are from Siberia, born and raised in a city called Omsk. About 5 years ago, I had a conversation with my dad that started off normal, but soon veered into something unexpected. We began talking about paranormal experiences in our lives. I asked him why he believed in Yetis. This surprised me, because my dad isn't the kind of man who believes in ghosts, aliens, or anything supernatural. He's a practical, no-nonsense type. But Yetis? He told me he's convinced they're real. He sat up straight, cleared his throat, and began sharing his story. When my dad was in his 20s, he served in the military. He was stationed at a place called Sputnik, a small village close to the Russian border with Norway. If you look it up on a map, you can still see the old barracks and the remainder of the military camp. It's remote, harsh, and surrounded by dense forest and rivers. In that military camp, all the heavy-duty equipment and supplies were stored far away from the soldiers, deep inside the forest in warehouses built to be isolated from human activity. One night, a group of 10 men, including my dad, were assigned to restock one of these warehouses. It was grueling work, loading trucks with heavy ammunition and gear. They set off late, but the journey took longer than expected. They got a flat tire on the rough dirt roads. When they finally reached the warehouse near a small city on the banks of the river, a place called Lovezero, it was already pitch black. The only light was the faint shimmer of stars overhead, filtered through a cold, heavy sky. They decided to stay overnight. The men were exhausted and needed to rest to do the heavy lifting the next day. There was a dugout nearby, a simple shelter with a sod roof covered in grass. They all laid down on the wooden floor inside, expecting to quickly doze off. But for some reason my dad couldn't. Something felt off. He stayed awake, laying there in the dark listening. When he glanced around, he realized he wasn't the only one lying awake. Every single man had his eyes open, staring at the ceiling or into the darkness. That feeling of unease was thick in the air, a creeping discomfort, like the forest itself was watching. And after a while it turned into a mild but gnawing fear. Then it started. A heavy thumping on the sod roof. At first, just a few uncertain footsteps, then heavier and deliberate, like someone or something was walking above them. The roof creaked under the weight. Each step echoed, reverberating through the thin wooden beams. The noise wasn't random. It was unmistakable, the sound of a large creature pacing slowly and circling. Hearts started pounding. The men's breathing became rapid and shallow. One of them began hyperventilating, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My dad said he could feel the vibrations in his chest, like the thumping was shaking his very insides. Then one of the shoulders passed out from sheer terror. Through the dim light, someone dared to open his eyes and peek outside. What he saw was a shadow, a massive silhouette looming near the edge of the dugout. It didn't come inside, but it watched them, silent, immense. Eventually the footsteps stopped, and the creature disappeared into the darkness. Only then did the men allow themselves to relax and drift off to a restless sleep. The next day, my dad's friend asked a local about the strange event. The local said it was nothing unusual in these parts. In fact, he gave the phenomenon a name, one which my dad never remembered. Remember, this was during the Soviet era, a time when belief in spirits or anything otherworldly was condemned as superstition. Religion was banned, and people who even talked about ghosts or demons were looked down upon. My dad and his comrades were elite soldiers, deeply committed to the state ideology, strong, practical men who believed only in what they could see and touch. For all of them to be struck so deeply by the experience, to be paralyzed with fear in the middle of the Siberian wilderness, it's something my dad still can't explain. He told me the story like it was yesterday, pale-faced and serious, not a ghost story or a myth, but a memory ingrained deeply into his mind. That night in the forest, something came close enough to touch them. Something enormous, ancient perhaps, and it left a mark that no soldier could forget. It was mid-November 2023. I was 17, stuck in that strange limbo between being a kid and almost an adult. Winter had slammed in hard, dumping snow everywhere, the aftermath of a brutal storm that had shut everything down for a couple of days. Like most nights back then, we were out with no real plan, just wandering, exploring, doing the dumb kind of late-night adventures only people our age could get away with. There were 7 of us: me, Dylan, Julian, Logan, Josiah, Bobby, for some reason carrying a full-sized axe, and Carlos. We'd already been chased off school property earlier that night, slipping through the fences and ducking into the woods. Eventually, we found ourselves on this snowy trail near the ocean. Everything was dead quiet. No cars, no wind, not even the distant hum of life. The snow was perfect, untouched, like a thick white blanket stretched over the world, and only our footsteps marred it. That's when we saw the shed. It sat alone in a clearing, framed by tall, skeletal trees. It looked abandoned, paint peeling like old scabs, windows fogged and cracked, the whole place sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Of course, we had to check it out. Julian and I were the first to step up. I tried the door, stuck, maybe frozen. The air felt heavy, not quite spooky yet, just off somehow. Logan, Dylan, and Josiah caught up while Bobby and Carlos lingered nervously by the trail. Dylan managed to slide open a side window. It was a tight squeeze, but he slipped in first. Logan followed, and Josiah was halfway through it when everything changed, because that's when we saw it. Me and Julian turned back towards the back of the shed, and there it was. Not a dog, not a man, but something caught in between. It had a human-like shape, but was all wrong. Pale, fur matted around its head, long, pointed Doberman ears, and dark eyes that reflected no light. It just stood there at the tree line, silent and unmoving, watching us. Julian froze. His voice cracked, half laughing, half panicked. "Oh, a dog?" But I saw it too. That was no dog. Josiah didn't hesitate. He wriggled backward out the window and bolted. Logan, seeing our faces, didn't even look. He just hurled himself through the window like he was dodging a bomb, screaming, "Dude, that ain't no dog." Then he vanished into the woods. Dylan, stuck halfway through the window, was kicking and flailing like a trapped worm. Instead of trying to get out, he scrambled inside, kicked the shed door open from inside, and sprinted into the night. Me and Julian, we ran too, laughing because that's how we deal with fear. We laughed and screamed like maniacs as we tore through the snow. Julian slipped, face first into the powder, still laughing, until he looked back at the shed. He froze. He shot up and ran faster than I'd ever seen, blowing past me, Bobby, and Carlos. It was like his life depended on it. There was no flashlight, just the eerie glow of the cloudy sky, brownish and thick above the snow. Logan's group gone, lost deeper into the woods. We split up, scrambling to find each other again, breathless, half laughing, half shaking. We finally regrouped at the tunnel under the bridge, which was our usual hideout. Inside it was pitch black. We used dying phone screens and lighters for light. Near the trapdoor entrance, Dylan lit a lighter and Logan snapped, "You moron!" We sprinted for the other side of the tunnel, and once outside, Logan explained lighting a flame in a closed tunnel with trapped gas and only one way out could have blown the whole place up, and we'd have roasted alive. Later, Back at Logan's house, the adrenaline wore off. Julian sat silent and trembling, barely speaking. Logan did the talking for him. Bobby, Carlos, and Josiah hadn't gotten a good look, but me and Dylan swore up and down we saw something, and it wasn't a damn dog. A year later, in the summer of 2024, Julian, Bobby, Carlos, and myself went back. The shed was changed, renovated bigger, repainted, no more condensation on the windows, no more broken glass. Someone had come to repair it. Whatever had been there that night, whatever watched us, it was gone with the snow. But that night lives rent-free in my head. Not because of what we did, but because of what we saw. That might have even followed us that night. And I still hear Logan's voice echoing across the snow-smothered woods. Dude, that ain't no dog. I don't think I'll ever forget it. This happened 2 summers ago in the Grand Tetons. My boyfriend at the time, now my husband, Harry, was a seasoned outdoorsman with a military background. He was studying ecology and eager to get into backpacking. He thought it was the perfect opportunity for my first real trip into the wilderness, just the 2 of us, 25 miles, completely off-grid. Now this place is spectacular, but not for the faint of heart. They're prime grizzly territory. The only bears I'd ever seen were black bears from the comfort of my car. Those big, grisly country signs posted every few miles didn't exactly ease my nerves. Harry looked like a walking survival catalog. Machete hanging from his belt, knives on both hips, bear spray clipped at the ready. We were a mile into the hike, struggling up the relentless incline, both of us drenched in sweat and panting under 40-pound packs. You're supposed to make noise to avoid startling bears, but we were too winded to talk. About an hour in, the trail began leveling off. A fast-moving stream ran to our left. That's when I noticed the silence. It dropped on us like a blanket. No birds, no wind, not even a buzzing fly. Just the stream. I caught Harry's eye, and I could tell he noticed it too. In the wild, silence is rarely a good sign. I was a few paces ahead when I crested the hill and froze. 10 feet in front of me, dead center in the trail, sat a massive grizzly. It hadn't seen Harry yet. I was too terrified to speak, so I started flinging one arm wildly behind me, trying to get his attention. When Harry caught sight of the bear, he acted instantly, pulled me behind him and began yelling. Not just yelling, bellowing, military drill sergeant style. His voice thundered from across the trees. The bear stood up, dropped to all 4 legs and began walking straight towards us. And then we heard it. A crack from deep within the woods to our right. A branch snapping, and the grizzly whipped its head towards the noise, hesitated for a split second and bolted towards the stream, like it had just seen the devil itself. A second crack ran out, closer this time. Harry muttered something about falling branches, but I could hear the tension in his voice. We picked up the pace, fast walking up the trail to put distance between us and whatever had spooked that bear. My skin crawled. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, and Harry stops in his tracks. I turned and saw it too. Down, where we'd have been standing just moments before, something large moved through the trees. At first it looked like another bear, dark brown and shaggy, but it was huge, at least 3 times bigger than the grizzly, and it had its back to us. Then it stood up. It rose impossibly tall, like a shadow peeling itself from the woods. The shape was wrong too, long in the arms, too narrow in the hips. Not a bear. We ran. I don't remember making the decision, my body just sort of took over, and I sprinted behind Harry, heart hammering in my chest, breath coming in gasps, heavy footfalls pounding the ground behind us, thudding in sync with our own. We didn't look back. Eventually, the footsteps faded. I was shaking and nearly in tears. Harry tried to calm me down, insisting it was all extremely unusual, that bears almost never behave this way. But I could tell he was rattled too. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. An hour later, we reached a flat clearing and decided to stop for a snack. We hadn't seen another soul since the hike began, and as we rested, I noticed something moving in the bushes nearby. A line of rustling branches coming straight towards us. Out came a young grizzly, smaller than the first but clearly agitated. Its eyes darted, posture low and tense. Before I could react, Harry jumped to his feet and ran towards it, yelling like a man possessed, bear spray in hand, waving the other like a madman, and the bear took off, crashing through the underbrush. I wanted to scream. Why were we being stalked by bears? This wasn't normal. But the worst was yet to come. Back at the ranger station, we'd filed our route before the trip, standard protocol. Rangers often check in on hikers during multi-day treks. According to the footprints, we'd been following a ranger on horseback that had passed through that day, but we must have missed them. We'd been out for 2 full days without seeing a single other person, and that afternoon, I developed some foot pain, and we lost precious daylight trying to fix it. By the time we resumed hiking, it was almost dark, and in the forest, darkness comes fast. My headlamp wouldn't work, the batteries were drained. Harry's was the only working light between us, and the wind howled through the trees, drowning out even our own voices. It was freezing. We finally found a place to set up camp at 9 p.m. A weird clearing shaped like a bowl, maybe 200 meters wide. The side sloped down steeply from the trail. Half of the trees inside were dead or rotting. Outside the bowl, everything was lush and green. To lighten the mood, Harry began playing some music on his speakers, thinking it might scare off predators. But the way the music echoed back at us made it worse, distorted, ghostly. And then came the silence. No music, no wind, no insects, just that dead hush, the same suffocating quiet we'd felt before the first bear encounter. We turned off the speaker and crawled into the tent, and just as we settled in, the cracks started again. Deep thudding noises beyond the tree line, not echoes, not wind, but a thud. It shook the ground beneath us, and then another thud. Closer, inside the clearing, we both froze. Then we heard something scrape across the tent wall, slowly and deliberately. It left a long dent in the fabric, like a finger dragging over nylon. "What is it?" I whispered. "I dunno. It shouldn't be a person. We're alone out here." My stomach dropped. Then the side of my tent slowly pushed inward. Something leaned into it, pressed against it. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it at the wall. My blood turned to ice. A human face, pressed into the fabric. Nose, open mouth. Each breath made the material puff in and out. Something was watching us. He whispered, "Screw that," reached into his sleeping bag and pulled out a Glock and racked it loudly. The face vanished. We heard footsteps sprinting across the clearing back towards the trees. We didn't even sleep. We didn't even unzip the tent until sunlight poured through the seams. When we finally crawled out, the first thing we smelled was urine. Someone had pissed on the dead fire pit. The coals were still warm. Steam rose off them in the cold morning. That's when we saw footprints, dozens of them, bare feet circling the tent, and handprints, smudged, muddy, and streaked across the nylon, all human-sized. We think it was mud anyway. Grizzlies are dangerous, but they're not the scariest things in the backcountry. Not even close. I'm glad to say that we made it back without further issues, but it was one of the most harrowing and horrible experiences of my life, and as you can imagine, I haven't been keen to go hiking in the deep woods again since then. A few years back, my wife and I were on a road trip vacation. Part of our route took us through Shiprock, New Mexico, where some friends of mine lived. Friends who weren't just casually into the paranormal but deeply immersed in it. Real investigators, you might say. We decided to stop over a few nights just to catch up. Over dinner we swapped stories. Bigfoots, strange lights, old legends. Eventually I told them straight up I wanted to go out and look for a Skinwalker. Really look, just once. I wanted to feel what it would be like to search in the dark for something no one could explain. And they hesitated hard. Most of them are Native American, and when it comes to Skinwalkers, they don't take it lightly. One of them finally agreed, just one, and told me he'd take me out the next evening. The others said they'd join me later in the week for a more standard Bigfoot investigation instead. So the next night at 5 p.m., my friend pulled up to the hotel in an old truck. We drove for over an hour, deep into the desert, mostly on narrow dirt roads. The sun dipped low, and soon we were swallowed by the kind of darkness that is ancient. We stopped at a place known locally for Skinwalker activity. I don't want to say where it was, but locals avoid it. Generations of warnings hang over that place like a fog. He killed the engine and we just sat there in the truck listening. At first it was just the typical night sounds, wind, the dry rattle of insects, crickets chirping, loud and aimless. He told me about recent sightings, people hearing voices that mimicked loved ones, animals with human eyes, shapes that moved like they shouldn't. An hour passed, then he said something that stopped me cold. "Get out the truck." "What?" I asked, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. He wanted me to step out, walk a few feet in front of the truck and just listen. Said he'd flip the lights on if anything happened, like I was bait. Now I had a weapon on me, but I knew the stories. Bullets wouldn't stop them unless they're blessed and dusted with a special kind of white ash, which mine weren't. Still, curiosity overruled caution, and I told myself I'd be fine. So I opened the door and stepped out. But the second I touched the handle, something changed. The night didn't just get darker, it felt thick, suffocating, like the darkness itself had become aware of us, like it was taking control. The temperature dropped so fast I got goosebumps, and all the sounds of nature, the crickets and other critters, were gone. Everything had been alive in the desert a minute ago, and now it was silent. And just as I was swinging the door open, foot hovering inches from the dirt, we heard a whistle right next to us. It wasn't coming from outside the truck. It wasn't even at the window. It sounded like it came from inside the cab. I froze, my blood went cold. I spun around, ready to catch my friend pulling some kind of joke. But when I looked at him, he wasn't moving. He'd gone pale, like all the blood had drained out of his face, his mouth slightly open, staring straight ahead. The whistle came again. Something was out there, or in there with us. I started yelling his name, trying to snap him out of it, shaking his arm, and he blinked, twitched like he was waking from a trance, and sprang into action. He turned the engine on, slammed the headlights on, and we both jumped out with flashlights drawn, sweeping the area. Nothing. Not a sound, not a track, not a whisper of what had been there. But as he was rattled, and when a Navajo man who spent his whole life surrounding this stuff says it's time to leave, you leave. So we did, and without another word. The next night, he and a few others took me out again, this time to look at an area near Shiprock Mountain. This wasn't a Skinwalker hunt. We were on the search for Bigfoot. It felt less ominous, but still heavy. The area we hiked into had been the site of multiple sightings, and after hours of walking we found what they called a Bigfoot nest, a sort of cleared out den packed with bones, deer bones, dozens of them picked clean. We examined the nest when we heard a yelp, not from a coyote but a mountain lion. It was deep, long and guttural. We spun around, flashlights scanning the tree line, but didn't see anything. But the two others did. movement. Just above us on the ridge, something large and humanoid. They were scared to even draw their weapons and cock them. And 10 minutes later we started hearing footsteps from all around us. They circled, closing in. No matter where we pointed our lights, we couldn't see what was making the sounds, but it was there, getting closer, less cautious. That's when we bailed. Even now I think about the whistle, the darkness, the weight of something you can't see standing just outside the beam of your flashlight. I know we're not alone out there. Back in the early 2000s, in the Rocky Mountains, my friend Adam and I, both 14 at the time, found ourselves deep within the mountains, far from any sort of civilization. We were camping with my family, and since we had our own separate tent, sneaking out for an adventure seemed like the perfect idea. It was the third night of the trip, and around 3 a.m., we decided to embark on a little night exploration. We didn't bother telling my parents. After all, we were teenagers who thought we were invincible. The cold mountain air was sharp against our skin as we trudged deeper into the woods, armed with only our flashlights and an overabundance of confidence. About 15 to 25 minutes into our hike, the thrill of adventure started to wane for me. The deeper we went, the more I couldn't shake the creeping unease that clawed at the back of my mind. At first, I ignored it, chalking it up to the eeriness of being surrounded by nothing but darkness and the distant sound of the forest. Finally, I stopped and turned to Adam. "Hey man, maybe we should head back. It's getting colder now and..." I hesitated, unwilling to admit that my nerves were getting the best of me. "I don't know, something just feels off." Adam scoffed and nudged my shoulder. "Oh, come on, don't be a baby. We barely got started." His excitement was unwavering, and against my better judgment, I agreed to push on. Another 10 minutes passed, the trees around us becoming more dense, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal fingers above our heads. Then as my flashlight flickered across the small clearing, I saw it, something that made my stomach drop. A figure. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was a tall, dark shape standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible between the trees. My breath hitched as I focused the beam of my flashlight on it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had impossibly long, thin legs, a distorted body, and most disturbingly, no arms. The way it stood there motionless, yet undeniably aware of us, sent ice-cold terror surging through my veins. "Adam," I whispered harshly, grabbing his arm. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze, and for a brief moment neither of us moved. Then, as if acknowledging our presence, the thing shifted. Not a step, not a lunge, just the slightest, most unnatural movement. That was all it took. Pure instinct took over, and I bolted, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. Adam was right behind me, our panicked footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I didn't care about the branches slicing my legs or the rocks that threatened to send me sprawling. I just ran faster than I ever had in my life. By the time we reached camp, my lungs burned, my legs were a mess of scratches and blood, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely undo the tent zipper. We didn't even try to return to our tent. Instead, we scrambled into my parents' tent, breathless and trembling. They woke up instantly, demanding to know what had happened, but neither of us could form the words to explain. For the rest of the trip, we refused to sleep alone, too terrified to risk another encounter with whatever was lurking in those woods. To this day, I don't know what we saw. It could have been a trick of the light. Maybe it was an animal distorted by the shadows. Or maybe it was something else entirely. When I was really little, maybe 5 or 6 years old, My family went on a camping trip deep in the Utah mountains. I remember the drive taking forever, winding up and up until we finally reached what felt like the very top of the world. We were so high that there was nowhere left to climb. At the summit was a small, cold mountain lake tucked into a pocket of pines and rock, and that's where we set up camp. It should have been perfect. The view was breathtaking and the air was clean, and the silence, aside from the wind through the trees, was total. My parents, my uncle and I were on the shore fishing that evening. My grandparents and my older brother were milling around the camp behind us. I was just a kid, casting a line and hoping to catch something, when everything changed. My dad was the first to see it. Across the lake, maybe 100 yards away on the opposite shoreline, stood a massive figure that wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still like a statue. Humanoid but wrong. It was covered from head to toe in brownish black hair and easily 8 feet tall if not taller. Even from that distance you could feel its size, its presence, like it was watching us. At first my dad thought it was a prank, maybe someone in a costume trying to scare campers. He yelled something, I don't remember what, but I remember that whatever this thing was answered back. It let out a sound I won't ever forget. Not a roar, not an animal call. It was a high, sharp, almost garbled screech-like language, but not any language we knew. It had cadence and purpose. Whatever it was saying, it sounded like it meant something, like it was trying to communicate. It felt alien. But then everyone was staring. My grandparents had come down to the lake, my brother too, even our dog had gone rigid, fixating on the thing across the water. Then my parents, God knows why, started mimicking the sound back, trying to repeat the strange vocalizations it had made, and it responded. Every time they echoed its strange speech, it answered back and forth for what felt like forever, but it was probably just a few minutes. It was the weirdest, most surreal moment of my life. I remember the wind picking up, the trees swaying, the way all of us stood there not speaking, just watching this thing have a conversation none of us could understand. And then suddenly it moved. It turned and bolted into the forest like it had somewhere to be, still upright and on 2 legs, but it moved with inhuman speed and was gone in seconds. My dad later said it must have been running close to 25 to 30 miles an hour. He'd never seen anything like it. Of course, my brother, grandpa, and our dog did the smartest thing they could think of. They chased it. They made it over to the other side of the lake pretty quick, following the same direction the creature had vanished in. I stayed behind, gripping my little fishing pole, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When they came back, they didn't have much, just a clump of long, coarse black hair they'd found snagged in an old stretch of barbed wire fence. Could have been from a bear, could have been from something else. We should have packed up and left, but we didn't. We stayed that night in the tents, right there on the shore. The wind howled all night long, and no one really slept. Every twig snap, every gust of wind had us on edge. Even the fire seemed smaller and dimmer somehow, like it couldn't hold back the dark. To this day I think about it sometimes. What it wanted, and why it tried communicating with us. The weirdest part, though, is in Utah, stories like this aren't even rare. My grandpa had a hunting buddy back in the 70s, who was honestly a bit of a hermit. This guy lived way out in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, deep within the Cascade Mountains. It was so remote that there was no running water, no electricity, and not a single paved road for miles. His cabin was a strange, eerie structure perched on top of a steep mountainside. It was built high on stilts, like it was trying to stay above something unseen in the forest below. The stilts raised the cabin at least 10 feet above the ground, and extending from the base of those stilts was a narrow balcony, a precarious ledge with no stairs nor ladder, nothing to climb up or climb down, except sheer drops on every side. Just that wooden platform jutting into the open air, very exposed and vulnerable. Grandpa swore this man wasn't the type to spin stories. He knew him well enough, and he was as honest and straightforward as they came. Grandpa himself wasn't one to buy into tall tales or ghost stories. But what happened that night left him shaken. They had spent the day hunting, trekking through thick brush and cold mountain air, and now the evening was setting in like a heavy blanket. Inside the cabin's single, roughly 300 square foot room, lit only by a small oil lamp, the two men sat quietly, catching their breath and sharing the silence that only close friends can share after a hard day. The air smelled of damp wood, smoke, and the sharp tang of dried jerky hanging from a beam. Then out of nowhere, the hermit looked straight at my grandpa and with eyes dead serious and no hint of a joke says, "Sasquatch is in the woods. You gotta be careful if you're out at night." Grandpa laughed, half in disbelief, half amused, thinking it was just one of those old local legends, some story to spook the visitor. But the man's expression didn't budge. It was like a warning carved into his face, as if this was the most ordinary thing in the world, and this was just a simple fact. He stood up and gathered a few pieces of fruit, some stale bread and strips of jerky, piling them carefully into a bowl. Then he went outside. Grandpa followed quietly behind, watching as the hermit carried the bowl out onto that narrow balcony, the one with no stairs and no way to climb up. He set the bowl right on the edge, balanced precariously above the forest floor. "It'll be gone by morning," he said flatly. And then, with nothing more, they retired to bed. The cabin's single room felt heavier after that. Grandpa settled into a cot near the window facing the balcony, and every creak of the mountain amplified the thick mountain silence. Hours later, deep in the black night, Grandpa was jolted awake. At first, it was just a soft rustling, subtle and strange, like the forest itself was breathing in a strange rhythm. And it was just outside the window. Or was it the forest? He got up, heart pounding, and carefully crept towards the window. He squinted, and outside the bowl was empty. Then, and this is the part he still can't shake, right at the edge of the balcony, he saw it. 4 huge, thick fingers, long and hairy, resting on the wood before disappearing into the shadows. These fingers were massive, larger than any human hand, and the hairs were dark and coarse. Grandpa froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The forest was deathly silent again, but in that moment he felt eyes burning into him from the darkness beyond the cabin. The next morning, the hermit's usual calm was gone. He wouldn't speak about it, just nodded grimly when my grandpa mentioned the empty bowl. After that night, Grandpa refused to hunt in those mountains again. The feeling of being watched, the unshakable presence, stayed with him for years. That night, my grandpa met something he never wanted to see again, lurking just out of sight, but almost close enough to touch. And I think it shook him to his core. Around 11:30 tonight, my boyfriend and I were leaving his house. We petted his dogs as usual and said goodbye. I mention this because it's important to mention that all his dogs were accounted for. Mac was inside, and we said goodbye to Baby, Sandy, and Little Bit. We saw all of them. My boyfriend lives on a private road where everyone knows each other. His parents have lived there for 10 years, and no new people have moved in during that time. If a new animal shows up, people notice quickly. Everyone talks, and the moment a stray appears, it's a topic of conversation. As we're pulling out, we saw a pair of glowing eyes about 50 feet away. My boyfriend thought it might be a bunny or some other small animal, especially since all the dogs were looking in that direction. Clearly curious, he turned the car on so the headlights would shine on it. But whatever it was didn't look normal. It was too big to be a cat, too small to be a deer, and too small to be a pig. But regardless of what it might have been, the most wild animal would have run away from the light. But this one didn't. At first, it went into a wooded area, but then it turned around and started inching towards us. The weirdest part? It would sit down after every step it took. Its shoulders didn't look like they were in the right place. To me, it looked like it was walking on its back legs, but my boyfriend says he saw it on all fours, so I'm not sure if it was switching between those two or if we saw it differently. This happened about 4 times before we drove off in fear. The way it moved wasn't natural. It had glowing yellow eyes and a black, slick coat, almost shiny. Its body looked slightly contorted, or like it was walking in a strange, twisted way. It kind of resembled a dog, but it wasn't. I'm still not sure what we saw. I can't explain it. Anyway, fast forward. Probably a detail I should have mentioned at the beginning, but the whole reason we went to his house was because he was spending the night at mine and had forgotten his clothes. So when we left my house, I left the gate open. Here's why that matters. I live with my grandparents who were disabled, and this is important because our driveway is about 150 yards long, if not longer. When we left the gate open, my grandparents were already asleep and wouldn't have to come out to close it. I know this because I've done it before and always try and make sure it's shut before they wake up in the morning. But when we got back, the gate was shut. My boyfriend and I were already pretty shaken by what we saw earlier, so we literally turned around, and now I'm sharing this from the parking lot. If you have any ideas on what this could be, I'd love to hear about it. I moved from New York to Vermont in early 2018, dragging the exhaustion of a brutal packing and relocation ordeal with me. I was renting a small home on the side of a mountain, tucked at the end of a remote dirt road. It allowed pets, which was crucial. I had my cat and my aging dog with me, and it was meant to be temporary, just a few months while I waited to close on a house. Zillow made it look closer to town, but I quickly realized just how isolated it really was. If 10 cars passed by in a day, that was considered traffic. The surrounding landscape was stunning at least. Wide front and back lawns, several acres of open space, all ringed in old pine, birch, and the skeletal remains of wintered tired trees. A frozen pond lay out front, a hulking apple tree in the back, still clinging a few shriveled apples even in March, and everything was buried under 4 feet of snow. Rock walls bordered the forest edges. My dog, already pushing 17, could barely walk. He was the kind of dog that you're lucky to have once in your life. I was warned not to let him off leash due to some alpacas a quarter of a mile down the hill that apparently had a vendetta against dogs. Not that my guy was fast-moving enough to provoke anything. The house was 1 story, modest, with automatic motion sensor lights that blinked on whenever anything passed in the driveway, which circled behind the house. There was a long, open, garage-style outbuilding about 30 feet from the kitchen, filled with old garden tools and storage bins. No doors, just a yawning black opening that felt less like a shed and more like a maw. Off the kitchen, there was a screened-in porch that overlooked the frozen pond, and I didn't realize how important that porch would be. The second night, things changed. It was around 8 p.m., and the snow had fallen fresh and heavy. I grabbed the dog's leash and stepped out wearing nothing but sneakers and a nightgown and a thin jacket. A foolish New Yorker move. I figured I'd be 5 minutes to let him do his business. I walked him along the plow portion of the driveway and turned to head back inside. But the door wouldn't budge. I'd locked myself out, as it was the type of knob that automatically locks behind you. The worst kind. My heart sank. No phone, no flashlight, no neighbors in sight, and my car, parked beside the back door, was locked too. I stood there shivering, trying not to panic. My only hope was the garage. I remembered seeing a crowbar in there earlier. If I could break a window and climb through, maybe I could avoid freezing to death outside like a jackass in pajamas. I tied my dog's leash to my car mirror and jogged over to the open outbuildings, snow soaking my sneakers. I found the crowbar easily. It was cold and heavy in my hand. I took a breath, turned away from the kitchen window, and swung hard over my shoulder. The metal hit glass and bounced off with a deafening metallic clang. Sparks flew. No crack, no shatter. Just the shock of unbroken safety glass and the eerie silence afterwards. What kind of rental had bulletproof windows? I tried another window with the same result. Panic tightened its grip. My fingers were going numb. My dog, out of sight around the corner, started barking frantically. Long, echoing barks that bounced off the surrounding forest. Then, the looming slope behind the house. I yelled at him to quiet down, but he only barked louder. Then suddenly silence, too cold and scared to question it. I kept moving. I remembered the screened porch. If I could get to it, maybe the interior kitchen door would still be unlocked. But to get there, I had to dig through a 15-foot-long path of untouched snow. I found a shovel in the garage and began carving a trench, breath heaving, legs burning from the cold. Every now and then I shouted for the dog, but still no sound. I told myself he was fine. He was old, probably just lying down. When I finally cleared the path to the porch, I nearly wept with relief to find the door unlocked. I squeezed through, waded to the kitchen, also unlocked. Thank God. And I rushed inside. The first thing I did was grab the house keys from the counter, then sprinted back to the car. But my dog was gone. The leash hung limp, cleanly torn, and my stomach dropped. I started calling for him, then circled to the back of the house, heart pounding. And there he was, wading back towards me through the snow, old as ever, tail wagging like nothing had happened. I knelt down and hugged him, my face buried in his fur. I examined the leash. It was one of those retractable ones, rated for over 100-pound dogs, but it was torn clean through. How did he even manage that? By the time I crawled into bed that night, my nerves were fried. I vowed to never leave the house again without keys. But what happened the next night made all of that, the cold, the lockout, the shattered nerves, seemed like child's play. That is when the knocking started. It was a clear night, stars painted thick across the sky. I took the dog out for his final walk, standing barefoot on the back steps for just a moment to marvel at the constellations, Orion's belt, the Pleiades. I hadn't seen stars this vivid since childhood. Then the knock. A single solid whack came from the right, maybe near the tree line at 2 o'clock. Then another, to my left near the 11 o'clock position. Not echoes, not branches. These were deliberate, sharp, and identical to the sound I made the night before when I struck the window with the crowbar. There was no wind, no movement, just cold silence and those two distinct knocks. I didn't wait around. I yanked the dog back inside and locked every door and window twice. The next night, I took no chances. Lights on, flashlight in hand, ski pole in the other to steady myself on ice, house keys securing in my jacket pocket. I kept our walk brief, but as we returned towards the house, something caught in my eye. Color, movement, a flash of reddish orange. At the edge of the yard, just beyond the open garage outbuilding, something was staring at me. Two glowing red-orange eyes, set wide apart at least 10 inches, watched me from just above the stone wall where the forest began. They didn't blink, they didn't waver. They were fixed and deliberate. At first I thought owl, but the spacing was all wrong. I swayed left and right, trying to see if it was some kind of reflector, something catching the porch light. Nope, the eyes tracked me. I stood frozen for a full minute, heart hammering in my chest. Whatever it was huge. I couldn't see a body, just those eyes burning in the night like twin coals. I backed away slowly and got inside. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I went back out, binoculars in hand. I walked out to the rock and surveyed everything. Nothing. No cans, no reflectors, just tracks. Just the woods and the cold silence of Vermont. I stayed in that house for another 3 or 4 weeks. I never saw those eyes again, but the feeling of being watched never fully left me. I'd step out during the day and catch myself glancing towards the trees, half expecting them to blink. That wasn't my first experience with something strange in the woods. I've had others back in New York, but those eyes, that knock, it felt different. Curious, not aggressive. Like something was announcing itself, testing the water. Oh, and one final detail. That first night when I locked myself out and went searching for tools, there was a key hanging right above the shovel. Could have saved myself a whole lot of stress. Got my full security deposit back, and I still miss that house. But I've never walked the dog at night the same way since. Today around 5 p.m, on the west coast of Sweden, it was already pitch black outside when my dad and I decided to go for a walk in a nearby forest. The trail we took was only about 10 minutes from civilization, but there were no streetlights, and we didn't bring any flashlights with us. Despite the darkness, the path was visible enough, maybe thanks to the bright moon or the faint glow in the sky, and we often walked together, usually talking about the most mundane things. We were walking next to a large lake, quiet except for the gentle lapping of water on the shore. Near the edge, we spotted a large group of ducks, maybe 50 or so, just floating calmly in the water close to the beach area. Everything seemed normal, until suddenly about 25 meters ahead of us, something darted across the trail. It wasn't like any animal either of us had seen before. The creature sprinted from right to left and vanished towards the lake in a flash. I'd estimate it stood about 150 centimeters tall, but it didn't run like a deer or a fox. It moved on all fours, but the front limbs were noticeably longer than the hind legs, almost as if it were a bipedal creature forced to run on all fours. Its fur or skin was beige or brown in color, blending into the dark woods. But its speed was terrifying, and it was incredibly fast, silent except for the pounding of its limbs on the forest floor. The ducks on the lake immediately freaked out. They erupted in chaos, flying into the air, flapping wildly and screaming loudly. I'm no wildlife expert, but even a deer or fox would rarely cause that kind of disturbance so close to people without making noise. Then, as if on cue, a heavy metallic smell filled the air. It was the sharp and unmistakable scent of iron and blood. Both my dad and I caught it instantly. I work in a hospital and deal with blood regularly, but I've never smelt anything like this in the wild before. It was overwhelming. What struck me the most, though, was my dad's reaction. He's a hardcore skeptic, a realist who loves science and grew up on a farm in the forests of Sweden. He's known the local wildlife better than anyone I know, and he was as shocked as I was. He said he'd never seen anything with that size or shape or speed. The closest guess was maybe a deer, but deer don't have legs with different lengths like that, nor do they usually come so close to people or move so fast and quietly. The creature's body seemed heavily built in the front, with much longer arms than legs. A gait I couldn't easily place either, and after it disappeared into the darkness near the lake, we stood there speechless. Could it be a goat man? Because the heavy iron smell reminded me of the folklore legends I've read about goat man. Many stories mention that same smell, but what it was exactly, I have no clue. About a decade ago, my buddy went camping in the wilds of northern Ontario with another guy. Everything started off great. They caught a bunch of fish and fried some up for dinner, hanging the rest in the trees to keep it fresh overnight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they settled in by the fire, enjoying the peaceful evenings. But then strange things started to happen. From the dark bush, they heard the usual nighttime noises, leaves rustling, twigs snapping, probably just a squirrel or maybe a raccoon. But then came something odd, strange and unsettling. Laughing sounds. At first, they brushed it off, but my buddy, glancing out of the corner of his eye, saw something small. He described it as a little Spider-Man, almost like a tiny, wiry figure skittering through the underbrush. His camping partner saw it too, a little human-like figure. He said it was hunched, like a cartoon dwarf. Spooked, they both bolted a few meters away from camp. When they returned, everything was eerie still, but the fish they had hung up in the trees were gone. In just a few minutes, all of it had vanished. On the surface, it doesn't sound too strange. Maybe a raccoon or a porcupine had snatched it all away. The mind plays tricks, and my buddy, a scientist by trade, is not one to get easily swept away by extraordinary explanations. But then the story took a curious turn. I was deep in the Ontario archives years later, researching for a dissertation, when I stumbled across an interview with an early 20th century explorer called Ernest Obelholzer. He recounted stories from his indigenous guide, Otuk Gawomawan, better known as Billy McGee. The man who traveled with him around Lake Superior spoke of legends among the Anishinaabe people called Mochifesu or Mamagrasi. These were said to be little people who not only played pranks on unsuspecting travelers, but were also known for their eerie and unsettling laugh. It was a strange connection to what my buddy had experienced. Could it be that the legends he heard were not just stories, but something older that still lives in those northern forests? My girlfriend and I had been wandering along the edge of a secluded cove near Cape Elizabeth, Maine, taking in the ocean air and the way the lighthouse beam cuts through the fog. The tide was low, revealing slick rocks and long ribbons of seaweed that swayed in the gentle surf. We stopped at an old wooden observation deck that jutted out over the rocky beach. From there, the moonlight shimmered off the water, turning the ocean into liquid silver. And that's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of seaweed or maybe some driftwood. But then it moved. A small dark figure stood alone at the shoreline, perfectly still. It was humanoid, no more than 4 feet tall. But something about its proportions were wrong. Its body was short and thin, but its head was enormous, nearly half its size, smooth and perfectly round. The moonlight danced off its surface, creating a strange, mirrored reflection that made it look almost transparent, like polished obsidian or deep, black water. A cold wave of unease ran through me. My girlfriend tensed beside me, her fingers digging into my arms. It wasn't just standing there. It was watching. The thing's head slowly turned in our direction, and for a split second, I thought I saw something shift inside it, like light refracting through deep water. My breath caught in my throat. Then my girlfriend screamed. The sound shattered the silence, and in an instant the thing reacted. It jerked, almost like it had been startled, then sprang into motion. But it didn't run, it leapt. Without a sound, it flung itself towards the water, its movements impossibly smooth, as if gravity barely applied to it. It didn't splash when it hit the surface. There was no thrashing, no signs of a struggle. It just disappeared beneath the waves like a stone sinking into the abyss. We stood frozen, staring down at the ocean. The water rippled slightly where it had gone under, then stilled. My heartbeat pounded my ears. My girlfriend whispered something, but I barely heard them over the sound of my own thoughts. What the hell had we just seen? Minutes passed. We waited for it to resurface, to crawl back onto the shore, to give us some kind of explanation. The cove remained empty. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, illuminating nothing but the endless black sea. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the way it moved, the way the moonlight had bent inside its head. I searched online for anything that might explain it, some kind of deep-sea creature, a local legend, a known cryptid. But nothing matched. To this day, I still don't know what we saw, and if anyone else might, I really would like to sate my curiosity. When I was 14, a friend and I made it a summer ritual to go fishing nearly every day. We didn't have a car or easy way to get to the spots we loved, so we'd set off on foot, trekking for an hour or sometimes an hour and a half through dense woods and mossy bogs. Our destination was a network of small rivers we called the Steadies. These narrow streams, no wider than 5 feet, wound their way through the forest and eventually spilled into a huge, quiet lake. The rivers were shallow and clear, perfect from hopping from bank to bank. At our age, it was easy to leap back and forth, making the journey part of the adventure. We knew every bend, every log, and every secret fishing hole along the way. But on our last trip there, something happened that changed everything. We were walking along one of the narrow rivers, casting casual glances into the water and scanning the forest. That day the air was thick and heavy. Suddenly we stumbled onto something unsettling, a large pile of animal bones. They were bleached white, scattered and weathered, something gnawed on by smaller forest creatures. At first we both froze. We weren't sure what to think, but after a moment we assumed perhaps a hunter had quartered their game there. It wasn't unheard of, especially in this remote area. We kept moving our steps slower and more cautious. Then we reached the edge of the riverbank. The water was crystal clear, revealing every pebble and ripple. And right in the center of the riverbed, like it was etched in stone, was a huge footprint. It was unmistakably a bare foot. The toes were clearly visible, splayed and distinct. It was the left foot. Enormous, far bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The water magnified it, making it appear even more gigantic and otherworldly. I called my friend over, eager to show him. As I shouted his name, though, a deep, low rumble shattered the silence, a sound like distant thunder, but coming from the dense trees across the river. Suddenly, the entire forest on that side began to shake violently, branches snapping, leaves rustling like a storm was rolling through. I turned towards my friend and he was gone. Only a cloud of dust rose where he had been standing. He was sprinting far, and his fear was contagious. Without hesitation, I followed, heart pounding, running blindly through the woods after him. We never looked back. That day, the peace and wonder of those woods vanished forever. We told people about what we'd seen and heard, but no one believed us. They said it was just a story, kids imagining things. But we both knew it was real. Something huge was out there, and that footprint proves it. When I was in 3rd grade, my family and I stayed in a small cabin deep in the redwoods. It was a place where trees pressed in close, and the night felt thick and endless. My parents shared one room with my little brother, who slept between them, and my older sister was on a sleeping bag on the floor nearby. As for me, I slept on the pull-out couch in the living room, and my best friend Colin was allowed to come along and sleep there with me. That night, we stayed up way past our bedtime playing Game Boy. The cabin was quiet except for the soft clicks of buttons and our whispered chatter. I remember drifting off while Colin's turn was going, I must have been dead tired from a long day of hiking because I fell asleep at around 3 a.m. That's when I felt a gentle nudge. Colin was shaking me awake. Half asleep, I asked what he wanted. He put a finger to his lips and pointed silently towards the window above the couch. Outside in the pale moonlight, we saw the swing set. It was taller than my dad, and my dad's 5'10". But towering over that, a shadowy figure, covered in thick hair. It was impossibly dark out. The cabin was in a small clearing surrounded by dense redwood forest, so the only light was the silver glow of the moon filtering through the trees. I was frozen, shock rooting me to the spot. I had heard stories about Bigfoot, but never really believed them, and never imagined I'd see one with my own eyes. The local area was known for sightings, and the gift shop sold souvenirs covered in Bigfoot images. But this was different. This was real. We stared at it for what felt like an eternity, and then I caught the creature's eye, glowing faintly in the dark as it looked back at us. After a moment, it turned and walked slowly downhill into the trees, its strides long and deliberate. Colin and I looked at each other, wide-eyed and silent. We weren't dreaming. This was real, and somehow, instead of fear, a surge of excitement washed over us. It was an incredible and unforgettable sight. We must have been utterly exhausted because after that we didn't stay up much longer and fell asleep quickly. The next morning we told my parents what we'd seen. They dismissed us and said it was a nice story, something two kids might dream up after a long day outdoors. For years after, Colin and I would joke about how we both saw Bigfoot together that one unforgettable night in the redwoods. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you have, you can let me know down below. And I would like to extend a huge thank you to my extra special members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen, who for a tiny amount of money every month get some cool perks. And if you'd like to find out more, follow the link in the description to find out more. That is it from me. I hope you have enjoyed the very first week of the June content bonanza. I'm going to see you tomorrow for a big fat compilation, which I very much hope is to your liking. And then on Monday, we're going to start off strong by returning to the haunted woods. Hopefully, see you there. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.